Hello, this is Domenico again, and we're going to continue our discussion regarding the relationships between total product, marginal product, and average product curve. But in this case, looking at the relationship between the MP, AP, and the marginal cost of production and the average total costs of production. So in the previous graph, we were looking at this relationship, and in addition to this graph, we had the total product curve as a parabola running up above the MP and the AP curve. You can see here that I have eliminated the total productivity curve, and we're just focusing on the marginal product curve, this red line, and the average product curve, but then its relationship to the marginal cost of production, which you see down here, and the average total cost of production. So we can see that they're kind of mirror images of each other. So this theory regarding the law of diminishing marginal returns and the marginal productivity explains why the supply curve has this upward sloping shape in accordance to the law of supply. So let's take a few notes before we look at these relationships and analyze it as we would on a paper one. So we've already gone over the marginal product curve and the average product curve. Now let's look at the supply curve. All right? Our supply curve, in this case S1, is equal to our marginal costs of production, right? The MC curve. And the marginal costs of production is equal to the change in total costs. So the all of our total fixed and total variable costs added together gives us our total costs. And so we're looking at the change in total costs as we produce an additional unit of output. So the change in the quantity of output. So the MC curve is the additional cost or the additional total cost of producing a good as we produce an additional unit of that good. And it's also equal to the change in the total variable costs, right? Total change in total variable costs over the change in the quantity of output. It is the same. Why? Because the fixed costs are constant. So if the total cost is changing, it's a result of a change in the variable cost. So thus, change in total variable costs is the same as the change in the total cost because the fixed costs are constant. What about the average total cost? Here, the ATC curve. ATC, average total costs, or cost on average for each unit of output, is the total costs of production, all of our fixed and variable costs, divided by the total quantity of output. So that just tells us how much each unit costs to produce on average. And that's important for a firm because if they know what the average cost of each unit is, then they know that the minimum price they have to accept to cover their costs. So of course they would price above their ATC to make some profit. So let's take a look at these relationships here. We've already gone over this in a previous video. We know that the marginal product curve and the average product curve are very similar to the difference, or similar to the difference between your marginal grade, your grade on your next test, versus your average. If you score an A and your average is a C, it pulls the average up. If you score an F and your average is a C, it pulls the average down. So we're just going to remember that when the MP curve is greater than the AP curve, then it pulls the AP curve, the average product curve, is moving upwards. As we see here, it's rising because the marginal product is greater than. And then when we see that the marginal product curve is less than the average product curve, the average product curve, the average product curve is falling. Right? Average product is falling, as we see here. The MP is less than the AP, so it's pulling the average up. Okay. Now we need to cover here the supply curve, right? The supply curve, our MC curve, has the same relationship. Here we see that when the MC, let's choose another color. when the MC curve is less than the ATC curve, it's pulling the ATC down. The average total costs of production are falling. And then we see when the marginal cost curve is greater than the average total cost of production, here the MC greater than the ATC, it pulls the average total cost of production up. So it's the same relationship between the marginal and the average. So why is it that the MP, when it's rising, the cost of production are falling? So first, let's pay attention to graph B, where we're measuring quantities of outputs on the x-axis. So we're taking our outputs from here and now plotting them on the x-axis of graph B. And on the y-axis, we're looking at the costs of production. So let's remember that when we analyzed graph A in the previous video, we're adding the first, the second, and then the third worker to our coffee shop. They specialize, they divide labor. There's enough space and resources between them. They're not getting in each other's way. And so the addition of the second and third worker really leads to a dramatic increase in the marginal productivity. Each worker is really producing quite a lot. They're actually producing more than the previous worker. So collectively, there's a lot of marginal productivity. What does that mean for the entrepreneur? For the entrepreneur, if they're hiring that second and third worker and they're getting a lot of production, a lot of output out of them, it must mean that the additional cost of hiring them is falling because you get so much output out of that first, second, third worker. So we're plotting the outputs on the x-axis. So when we get to the first, second, third worker, they're producing 6 units, all right, of this particular good or service. The marginal costs of production are falling because the marginal productivity is rising. You're getting so much productivity. But then what happens? We see that at point B1 and at point B2, we have this dotted line to make sure they're in alignment. The law of diminishing marginal returns takes hold. The additional variable inputs are confronting the limitations of their fixed resources. Here, there's not enough space for the workers. They have to wait because one worker is using a particular resource that they may need. And so the marginal productivity begins to fall as we add the fourth and the fifth and then the sixth worker. Marginal productivity is falling. And so for the entrepreneur to hire that fourth and fifth and sixth worker, since we're getting declining marginal productivity, it must mean that the costs of production are rising. There's periods of time when this fourth, fifth, and sixth worker may be sitting idle, may not be actually doing anything because they're waiting for a resource to be freed up. There's not enough resources to be shared, or they're getting into the way of each other and they're bumping into each other and they're slowing each other down. So as a result, the costs of production for the entrepreneur are rising. Okay, so that's the relationship between the MP and the MC, which basically explains the why the supply curve is upward sloping, why the marginal costs of production are rising because of the law of diminishing marginal returns. And again, we already know this relationship between the MC and the AT, as we explained. When the marginal costs from A2 to B2 to C2 is less than the average cost of production, pulls the average down. Then they equal each other at point C2, which is where ATC is at minimum. And that's an important point because by definition, productive efficiency is when is equal to production at minimum ATC, or minimum average total costs. So you can't be any more productively efficient than producing at minimum average total costs at point C2. But we see that beyond that point, the marginal cost curve is greater than the average total cost curve, so it immediately pulls the average up. So let's go ahead and analyze this as we would on a paper 1 exam. So again, we see here the same graph. And below we have an outline of an analysis for paper 1. So let's go ahead and read. As can be seen, we have two economic models, graph A and graph B, illustrating a firm, in this case a coffee shop again, in the short run where at least one factor of production is fixed. In this case, the land and the physical capital of the commercial space are fixed. In graph A, on the x-axis, we're measuring the quantity of variable inputs, labor, and on the y-axis, we're measuring the quantity of outputs, right, or the quantity of coffee being produced. In graph B, the x-axis is measuring the quantity of outputs or coffee, while on the y-axis, we're measuring the costs of production. All right, so we want to remember to correctly label these axes for an exam. In graph A, the entrepreneur hires the first, the second, the third units of labor. As labor is added, employees engage in the division of labor and specialization, which results in the marginal product, which is the change in output over the change in input, increasing from point A1 to B1. Right? Marginal product is rising. But at point B1, the law of diminishing marginal returns sets in as a result of the entrepreneur hiring a fourth unit of labor and later a fifth and a sixth worker. With the fourth unit of labor, there is not enough space for the employees to work. Thus, they begin to get in each other's way, and there are not enough resources to be shared between them. This results in the MP curve to decrease from point B1 to C1 to D1, as we've seen before in the previous video, which means that the additional output of each additional unit of input is less than the previous unit of input. Next, we will analyze the relationship between the MP and the AP curves. The relationship is similar to a student's marginal grade and their average grade. If a student has a C average and scores a B on their next exam, which is their marginal grade, then their average grade rises. If a student scores a D on their next exam, it pulls their C average down. Thus, we can see that when the marginal product is greater than the average, from points A1 to B1 to C1, the AP curve is increasing from points A1 to C1. But then we also see that when the MP is less than the AP, from point C1 to D1, the AP curve is decreasing from C1 to E1. So this is similar to the previous video. A1, B1, C1, greater than average, average is being pulled up. And then from C1 to D1, MP is pulling the average down. All right, it should be noted that the MP equals AP when AP is at its highest point, point H. Now let's look at the next graph. In graph B, we notice that as the MP curve increases in graph A from A1 to B1, that the marginal cost curve, which is the change in total costs, divided by the change in the quantity of total output, decreases from A2 to B2. This is a result of the fact that the marginal product is increasing due to the division of labor and specialization, which results in marginal costs falling as a result of this increasing marginal productivity. Then at B1 and B2, the law of diminishing marginal returns sets in, leading to decreasing marginal production in graph 1, which translates to marginal costs of graph B from point B2 to C2 to D2 to increase. Marginal costs are rising as employees do not have enough resources to be shared between them to produce, or they do not have enough space, and they begin to get in each other's way, slowing down production. All right. Whoop. All right, so as the MP rises, marginal costs are falling, and then as the marginal productivity falls, the marginal costs are rising. And last, right, to sum this up, in regards to the relationship between MC and ATC, we can see that when the MC is less than the ATC, from points A2 to B2 to C2, the ATC curve is decreasing from points A2 to C2. And then we also see that when the MC is greater than the ATC, from points C2 to D2, the ATC curve is increasing from C2 to E2. It should be noted that MC equals ATC when ATC is at its lowest point, thus it is productively efficient. That is the productively efficient point. So that's a very thorough analysis, a very step-by-step analysis of graph A and the relationship between MP and AP, and then comparing the relationship between MP and the MC to connect these two graphs, and then focusing on the relationship between the MC and the ATC curves. So hopefully you find this useful and helpful in helping you to accurately draw, but importantly to accurately explain or analyze this model for a paper IB economics exam. And that's it. Thank you so much. And please don't forget to subscribe, like, and to comment.